My name's Nick Bullman, and I'm the founder and managing director of CheckRisk. To define risk, you really have to understand what it isn't. The traditional view has been that risk is, simply put as a formula, risk equals the probability of a loss times the amount of a loss, and that gave you your formula. But the problem with it is that if you haven't invested yet, then your probability of a loss is zero, and therefore your risk is zero. But everyone knows that if you haven't invested, you've got an opportunity cost, and even investing in cash has risk. So for us, risk is uncertainty, and that goes back to the sort of founding principles when people are looking at risk and trying to work out what it was. And for us, we define it as uncertainty of not achieving your objectives. So whatever objective you've set, risk is represented by the uncertainty of not being able to achieve that risk, that objective. Risk is actually quite a tricky thing to measure. Benoit Mandelbrot wrote a book called The Misbehavior of Markets, and in that he identified that risk is non-linear. And whenever you're dealing with a non-linearity, the best way to measure it is using rate of change. So in our model, we use rate of change being one of the primary tools for measuring risk and the rate of change of risk. We also use behavioral inputs, meaning human factors, as well as econometric and market risk factors. And by combining all three of those and then using rate of change, we can measure how the risk environment is changing in the now rather than in the past and projecting it forward. Well, the traditional view has been that risk tolerance is a constant, and we fundamentally disagree with that. We think risk tolerance changes. There are elements of it that are constant over a period of time, but if the macroeconomic environment changes radically, then most people's risk tolerance changes. So the first thing to understand is that an individual's risk tolerance changes with age, it changes with economic circumstances, and it changes with the macroeconomic background. There are several components to risk tolerance, and the first is that the individual's actual risk tolerance, what they believe that they can sustain in terms of loss. The second is their actual financial ability to do so, which may be quite distinct from their own view about losses. And then the third is the macroeconomic environment. So it's very important to not look at any of those in isolation, because what we might term an aggressive investor may not be an aggressive investor if they haven't got enough money to sustain the loss that they think that they could sustain. And thirdly, if the macroeconomic environment changes for the worse, just as we saw in the GFC, then their risk tolerance will be very different. At present, the system is to review a client's risk tolerance at the start of their investment process, and then to try and adjust their exposure to risk through their asset allocation over time. But there are issues with that. First of all, because as we've stated earlier, risk tolerance changes, you actually need to be doing that survey more frequently that's being done. We're currently working with the University of Bath and the University of Bristol, designing questionnaires that are very short but very accurate in terms of assessing a person's risk assessment in the current time frame, and that should allow IFAs to be more proactive in terms of changing the risk allocation that the client has. When people consider risk, they often think about what it stops them from doing. There's this sort of preconception that if you're paying attention to risk, you can't do certain things. It just constricts your choices. But understanding risk means, do you understand, are you being paid to take risk at the moment? And in that environment, risk may be a real positive. In other words, there are times in the market when it's absolutely essential to take excess risk because you're being paid to do so. There are times when you just shouldn't as well. I think the history of modern portfolio theory is based in Eugene Farmer's work at the University of Chicago in the 50s. And the problem is modern portfolio theory, value at risk, a lot of the risk systems are all based in this idea that that all investors are rational. The fact is, the efficient market hypothesis just simply doesn't work, and modern portfolio theory, in our opinion, doesn't work either. Value at risk certainly doesn't work, and you can ask anyone at some of the big banks that have lost huge amounts of money that were using value at risk for proof positive of that. But the point is that it'll take time for academia to accept that behavioral finance has a role to play. It will take time for people to understand that we've got to look at risk in a different way, but investors don't have to wait. That's just academia and the regulators taking time to catch up with where the cutting edge is.